When a government begins seizing ships on the open ocean, something has changed that press releases cannot adequately describe. Not inspecting ships, not interdicting specific vessels with specific contraband under specific legal frameworks that have existed for decades. Seizing them, detaining their crews, redirecting their cargo, asserting the right to stop, board, and commandeer commercial vessels in international waters based on criteria that are defined unilaterally, applied selectively, and enforced by the most powerful navy in human history. This is what the United States has now signaled it is prepared to do. And the word signaled is doing less work in that sentence than you might think, because several of these seizures have already occurred, not in the headlines you may have noticed. In the shipping industry databases, in the maritime insurance market's emergency risk reassessments, in the quiet terror of shipping company executives who are now running calculations about which routes are safe, which flags provide protection, and whether the legal concept of freedom of navigation, the foundational principle of global maritime commerce for 3 centuries, still means what it meant 6 months ago. It does not. Something has broken in the architecture of international maritime order, and the speed at which it broke, the distance between the world of 2 months ago and the world of today, is itself the most important signal. Because when foundational rules collapse this quickly, it is never just the rule that collapses. It is the entire system of expectations, planning assumptions, and behavioral predictability that the rule underwrote. And when that system collapses, the world does not simply adjust to a new set of rules. It enters a period of ungoverned competition in which every actor is simultaneously reassessing what is permissible, what is enforceable, and what the consequences of any given action will actually be. We are in that period now, and it is expanding faster than any established analytical framework is equipped to track. Let's establish what is actually happening with the specificity that the situation demands, because the vagueness of the public framing is itself a mechanism for preventing the full picture from being understood. The United States has been operating a regime of increasingly aggressive maritime interdiction, the polite term, targeted primarily at vessels carrying Iranian oil, Venezuelan oil, and goods moving through supply chains that American sanctions designate as prohibited. This regime has existed in some form for years. What has changed in the current period is threefold. The geographic scope has expanded dramatically. The legal justifications being invoked have become more aggressive and more contested, and the willingness to act against vessels with connections to major trading nations, not just vessels flying flags of convenience from small states with no capacity to respond, has increased to a level that represents a qualitative break from previous practice. The expansion of geographic scope means that interdiction operations are now being conducted in waters that previous administrations treated as too politically sensitive for unilateral American action. The Persian Gulf and the Red Sea have always been zones of active American naval operations. What is new is the extension of aggressive interdiction posture into the Indian Ocean, into the waters approaches to the Strait of Malacca, and into transit corridors that serve the trade of major Asian economies that have not been party to the sanctions regimes being enforced. The expansion of legal justification means that the United States is now invoking authorities that most international maritime lawyers regard as legally contested at best and flatly illegal under international law at worst. The right of hot pursuit, which allows the seizure of a vessel that has committed a violation in territorial waters and has been continuously pursued into international waters, is being stretched beyond any previously accepted interpretation. The authority to board and seize based on sanctions designations that other countries do not recognize, that the countries whose flags the vessels fly explicitly reject, is being asserted as though the American legal designation creates a right enforceable against all vessels, regardless of flag or cargo origin. This matters because the flag state system, the principle that a vessel on the high seas is subject to the jurisdiction of the country whose flag it flies, and to that country's jurisdiction alone, absent specific exceptions under treaty or customary law, is the foundational principle of international maritime order. It is what makes global maritime trade possible. Without the flag state system, every ship in every ocean is potentially subject to the jurisdiction of every navy powerful enough to stop it. The commercial implications of that condition are, for global trade, catastrophic. The expansion of willingness to act against vessels with major power connections is the most geopolitically explosive dimension. When the United States seizes a vessel with connections to a Greek shipping company, or a vessel that recently loaded in a Chinese port, or a vessel whose cargo has insurance coverage from a major European underwriter, it is no longer operating against the periphery of the global trading system. It is operating against the core. And the responses from the core are qualitatively different from the responses of small states with no capacity for retaliation. Greece, which operates the world's largest merchant fleet and whose shipping industry is a pillar of the national economy, has communicated through diplomatic channels a level of alarm that has not been publicly reported, but that is driving emergency consultations at the highest levels of the European Union. China, which is simultaneously the world's largest trader, the world's largest shipbuilder, and a country with specific security commitments to the protection of Chinese-flagged and Chinese-connected vessels, has issued statements through official channels that are carefully worded in their diplomatic language and explicit in their strategic implication. Chinese vessels and Chinese commercial interests will be protected. The protection of Chinese commercial interests by China is not a hypothetical. China has been systematically building the naval capacity, the diplomatic infrastructure, and the legal frameworks to operate as a global maritime power for 2 decades. The People's Liberation Army Navy is now the world's largest navy by vessel count. And while it lacks the combat experience and operational integration of the United States Navy in several critical dimensions, it has been specifically configured to operate in the maritime corridors most relevant to Chinese trade: the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific approaches. Chinese naval vessels accompanying Chinese commercial shipping is not a scenario that requires improvisation. It is a scenario for which China has been preparing. Now here is where the expansion dynamic becomes genuinely dangerous, and where the speed of what is happening starts to exceed the pace at which any stabilizing mechanism can respond. The American ship seizure posture is not being implemented in isolation. It is being implemented simultaneously with the Hormuz closure we examined, with the ongoing degradation of the rules-based trading system through tariff escalation, with the weakening of the alliance relationships that might otherwise provide diplomatic channels for managing these confrontations, and with a domestic political environment that is simultaneously demanding aggressive action and deeply averse to the kind of sustained military commitment that aggressive action in multiple theaters simultaneously would require. The combination of these simultaneous pressures is producing a maritime environment that has no historical precedent in the post-World War II era. The last time the global maritime order experienced this level of simultaneous challenge to its foundational rules was in the late 1930s, when the collapse of the international legal order produced an environment in which every maritime power was improvising its responses to a system that was disintegrating faster than any actor could manage. The analogy is not precise. It is instructive. Let's trace the specific escalation pathways that the current situation is generating, because understanding the pathways is the prerequisite for assessing which outcomes are most likely and what their consequences would be. The first pathway is the great power maritime confrontation. This is the scenario in which a Chinese-flagged vessel, or a vessel under Chinese escort, or a vessel whose seizure China has explicitly stated would constitute an unacceptable provocation, is subjected to American interdiction action. The Chinese response to such an action cannot be diplomatic silence. The internal political dynamics of the Chinese system, the nationalism that the Chinese Communist Party has cultivated as a legitimizing force and that now constrains the party's ability to accept visible humiliation, make a substantive response to such a seizure politically mandatory for Chinese leadership. What form that response takes is the variable. The spectrum runs from formal diplomatic protest through economic retaliation through naval confrontation. The middle of that spectrum, naval confrontation that stops short of kinetic engagement, is the most likely initial response, and it is also the most dangerous, because naval confrontations in contested waters with unclear rules of engagement and degraded communication channels are precisely the environment in which the kind of incident that neither side intends can occur. An incident between American and Chinese naval vessels, a collision, a warning shot misinterpreted, a boarding attempt that produces casualties, would not automatically produce a war, but it would produce a crisis whose management would require exactly the communication channels, the mutual understanding of red lines, and the political bandwidth in both capitals that the current environment has most severely degraded. Managing a U.S.-China naval incident while simultaneously managing the Hormuz closure, the economic disruption of the tariff conflict, the domestic political pressures in both countries, and the responses of every other actor in the system is a crisis management challenge that exceeds the demonstrated capacity of either government in the current configuration. The second escalation pathway is the insurance and shipping collapse. This pathway does not require a dramatic military confrontation. It operates through the quiet mathematics of commercial risk. The maritime insurance market is the invisible infrastructure of global trade. Without insurance coverage, commercial vessels cannot legally operate in most ports. Without insurance coverage, the financing for the vessels themselves and their cargo cannot be secured. Without insurance coverage, the entire commercial maritime system, which carries approximately 90% of global trade by volume, ceases to function. The insurance market responds to risk through premium increases and coverage exclusions. When the risk in a specific maritime zone exceeds the level that can be priced into a commercially viable premium, coverage is withdrawn rather than increased. The Lloyd's of London market and the other major maritime insurers have been here before, during the tanker war, during the Gulf War, during various regional conflicts that elevated maritime risk. Their response is calibrated and swift. Zones of high risk are designated. Premiums are increased to prohibitive levels for commercial operators, and shipping routes are altered to avoid the designated zones. The current maritime environment is generating risk assessments that are, in the judgment of senior underwriters, unlike anything in the post-Cold War period. Not because any single zone is more dangerous than previous conflict zones, but because the number of simultaneously elevated risk zones, the Gulf, the Red Sea, the waters around the seizure operations, the potential confrontation zones in the South China Sea and Indian Ocean, exceeds the market's capacity to price them independently. When multiple major maritime corridors are simultaneously high risk, the diversification logic that allows the market to cover individual risky zones breaks down. The correlations between risks in different zones are no longer close to zero. They are becoming positive, which means that a loss event in one zone increases rather than decreases the probability of a loss event in another. A maritime insurance market that cannot price the risks of global shipping in a commercially viable way is a market that withdraws coverage. And a global shipping industry without insurance coverage is a global shipping industry that cannot operate. The economic consequences of a significant withdrawal of maritime insurance coverage are not gradual. They are immediate and total. Ships do not sail without insurance. Cargo does not move. Ports do not receive vessels. Economies that depend on maritime trade, which is all of them, experience a supply shock of a magnitude that has no precedent in the post-war era. The third escalation pathway is the legal framework collapse, and it is the most consequential for the long term, even if it is the least dramatic in the short term. The rules-based international order is, at its core, a set of behavioral expectations enforced by a combination of legal frameworks, institutional mechanisms, and the reputational costs of violation. The maritime component of that order, the law of the sea, the flag state system, the principle of freedom of navigation, the specific legal frameworks governing interdiction and seizure, has been one of its most robust and universally observed components because all major maritime powers have had strong interests in its maintenance. When the most powerful maritime power begins systematically violating the foundational principles of that framework, asserting extraterritorial jurisdiction over vessels of all flags, applying domestic legal designations as though they create rights enforceable in international waters, seizing vessels based on unilaterally defined criteria that other states explicitly reject, it does not simply break the rules. It demonstrates that the rules are not self-enforcing, that they depend on the most powerful actor's choice to observe them, and that when the most powerful actor chooses not to observe them, the only alternatives are submission or counter-violation. Submission means accepting American extraterritorial jurisdiction over global maritime commerce. No major maritime power, not China, not Russia, not the European Union collectively, not India, has the domestic political capacity to publicly accept that position. It would represent a formal acknowledgement of American legal supremacy over international waters that no sovereign government can survive politically by accepting. Counter-violation means asserting competing extraterritorial jurisdictions, conducting competing interdiction operations, establishing competing legal frameworks for maritime access and trade, It means the maritime equivalent of what happened to international trade law when the tariff conflict destroyed the WTO's Dispute Resolution Authority, a return to power-based unilateralism in which every major maritime power does what it can enforce rather than what the rules prescribe. A world of competing maritime unilateralism is not a world in which global trade functions as it has for the past 70 years. It is a world in which the maritime commons becomes a zone of great power competition rather than a shared commercial resource. The efficiency losses from such a transformation are almost incalculable. They touch every supply chain, every commodity market, every manufactured good that crosses an ocean. Now here is the dimension that most real-time analysis is missing: the interaction between the maritime escalation and the other simultaneous crises in the system. The escalation pathways we have examined, the great power naval confrontation, the insurance market collapse, the legal framework dissolution, are not independent scenarios. They are interacting with the Hormuz closure, with the financial market stress, with the domestic political crises in the major democracies, and with each other. Each interaction produces effects that exceed the sum of the individual components. The Hormuz closure increases the insurance risk in the Gulf, which increases the pressure on the insurance market, which reduces the coverage available for vessels in all high-risk zones, which accelerates the commercial shipping withdrawal from multiple regions simultaneously, which amplifies the supply shock beyond what the Hormuz closure alone would produce. The great power naval confrontation risk reduces the diplomatic bandwidth available for managing the Hormuz crisis, because the same governments and the same diplomatic channels that are needed for both crises simultaneously cannot fully focus on either one. The crisis management capacity of the international system is finite, and it is being simultaneously demanded by more crises than it can effectively manage. The legal framework collapse destroys the neutral arbitration mechanisms that might otherwise provide face-saving off-ramps for de-escalation. When the legal framework is itself in dispute, when there is no agreed-upon basis for determining what any actor's rights and obligations actually are, the resolution of specific incidents requires bilateral negotiation between the parties rather than reference to an agreed framework. Bilateral negotiation between parties with fundamentally opposed positions, no established communication channels, and domestic political constraints against visible concession is extraordinarily slow and fragile. The incidents will accumulate faster than the negotiations can resolve them. The financial market dimension is the accelerant. Every day that the maritime crisis continues, every day that the insurance market reprices, every day that shipping routes are disrupted and commodity flows are reduced, adds to the pressure on financial markets that are already stressed from multiple directions. The financial market cannot quarantine the maritime crisis from the fiscal stress and the currency credibility questions and the trade conflict disruption. It prices all of them simultaneously. And the pricing of all of them simultaneously produces volatility that is itself economically destructive, that causes investment to freeze, that causes trade credit to tighten, that causes the financial lubrication of the global economy to become viscous and then to congeal. Let's talk about China, because China's position in this specific moment is more complex and more consequential than either the threat narrative or the partnership narrative that dominates the public framing. China is simultaneously the country most economically threatened by the maritime disruption. As the world's largest trading nation and largest oil importer, a maritime crisis hits China's supply chains and energy security more directly than any other major economy. And the country whose strategic interests are most advanced by the demonstration that American maritime dominance is contestable. This tension in Chinese interests produces a specific behavioral pattern that is difficult to read from outside the system, but that is critical for understanding how the crisis evolves. China will not be a passive actor in the maritime confrontation. It will not simply accept American seizures of vessels with Chinese connections and respond with diplomatic protests. But it will also not immediately escalate to military confrontation, because the economic costs of the disruption hurt China too, and because a military confrontation with the United States in the current environment carries risks that Chinese strategic planning has not assessed as acceptable under current conditions. What China will do, and what the evidence of Chinese behavior in previous crises suggests it will do, is pursue a dual track. On the visible track, it will respond to American seizures with escalating diplomatic and economic countermeasures, formal legal challenges in international forums, economic pressure on American interests in China, public statements that establish the Chinese position for the historical record and for the domestic audience. On the less visible track, it will use its diplomatic relationships, particularly its relationship with Iran, to accelerate the movement toward a negotiated framework that resolves the Hormuz closure on terms favorable to both Iran and China, reducing the maritime crisis's economic cost to China while positioning China as the indispensable mediating power. That goal is achievable in the current environment. The question is whether the United States recognizes the strategic dynamic clearly enough to adjust its posture before the Chinese position is consolidated in ways that make adjustment meaningless. The answer to that question requires an assessment of American strategic decision-making capacity in the current environment that is, to put it with the bluntness the situation demands, not encouraging. The ship seizure policy has not emerged from a coherent strategic process that has weighed its costs against its benefits in the full context of the simultaneous crises we have examined. It has emerged from a political environment that rewards aggressive unilateral action, that lacks the institutional mechanisms for the kind of careful second and third order effect analysis that would reveal the self-defeating dimensions of the policy, and that is operating under domestic political pressures that make visible de-escalation politically costly regardless of the strategic logic. The institutional degradation of the American foreign policy apparatus, the reduction in career diplomatic capacity, the subordination of strategic analysis to political messaging, the erosion of the interagency processes that would normally synthesize military, economic, and diplomatic considerations into coherent policy, means that the self-defeating dynamic we identified in the Iran context operates with even more force in this more complex, faster-moving maritime crisis. The world's most powerful maritime nation is pursuing a maritime policy that is simultaneously destroying the legal framework that underwrites its own maritime dominance, generating great power confrontations it is not institutionally positioned to manage, activating economic disruptions that hit its own economy and its allies' economies harder than the targets of the policy, and accelerating the construction of the alternative maritime order that China has been building for 2 decades. This is the perfect strategic own goal, not because the motivations behind the policy are incomprehensible. The desire to enforce sanctions to maximize economic pressure on adversaries to demonstrate strength in a moment of perceived weakness, but because the execution produces the opposite of the intended strategic effect at every level above the tactical. What happens next depends on the speed at which several processes reach their critical points. The insurance market repricing is the fastest clock. It operates in days and weeks. If the maritime risk environment continues to deteriorate at the current pace, coverage withdrawals from the most affected zones will begin to produce commercial shipping disruptions within weeks that are operationally significant and politically forcing. The Great Power Incident clock is less predictable in its timing, but more predictable in its direction. Every day that American naval vessels operate in contested maritime zones under aggressive interdiction orders, in proximity to Chinese connected vessels, and in waters where Chinese naval presence is increasing, the probability of an incident that requires political management at the highest level increases. The question is not whether such an incident will occur. It is when and whether the political and diplomatic infrastructure to manage it without catastrophic escalation will be available when it does. The legal framework clock operates on a longer timeline, but with the most durable consequences. The precedents being set by the current American maritime posture are being recorded, analyzed, and responded to by every maritime power and every maritime legal system in the world. The counter-framework being constructed by China, by Russia, by the coalition of states that reject American extraterritorial maritime jurisdiction, it will take longer to fully materialize. But it is being constructed now, and its construction is accelerating with every American seizure that demonstrates the necessity of an alternative framework. The economic clock is the one that all the others feed into, and it is the one that ultimately forces the political resolution. Economic pain, real, widespread, politically mobilizing economic pain, is the forcing function that has historically produced the political will for crisis resolution when diplomatic and military dynamics have failed to produce it. The economic pain is building. It is not yet at the level that forces resolution, but the trajectory is clear, and the timeline is measured in weeks and months rather than years. Here is what the people navigating this environment need to understand at the level of concrete decision-making rather than abstract analysis. The global maritime order that has underwritten the economics of the past 70 years is in a process of rapid transformation whose endpoint is genuinely uncertain. The specific rules, the specific institutional frameworks, the specific behavioral expectations that have made global maritime trade possible and predictable are being contested simultaneously by multiple actors and are no longer reliable guides to what will actually happen in any specific case. For businesses that depend on maritime supply chains, which is most significant businesses in the global economy, this means that the planning assumptions that have governed logistics, inventory management, and supplier relationships need to be fundamentally reassessed. The just-in-time supply chain model, which depends on predictable maritime transit times and costs, is structurally incompatible with the maritime environment that is now emerging. The diversification of supply chains, the building of inventory buffers, the development of alternative routing and alternative suppliers, these are not optional enhancements to resilience in the current environment. They are the prerequisites for continued commercial viability. For governments managing national economic interests, the period of maximum danger is the next several months, during which the accumulation of maritime disruption will intersect with the existing fiscal and financial market stresses in ways that produce acute crisis conditions in specific economies. The governments best positioned to navigate this period are those that have maintained sufficient fiscal space to absorb supply shocks, sufficient energy security through domestic production or diversified supply, and sufficient diplomatic relationships to participate in the negotiated resolution that will eventually emerge. The post-war order was a system. Its components were interconnected. Its stability depended on the simultaneous function of multiple interlocking mechanisms: the financial architecture, the trade framework, the security alliances, the maritime order, the institutional legitimacy that underlined all of them. What is now happening is not the failure of any individual component. It is the progressive failure of multiple components simultaneously, each failure accelerating the others, the whole moving toward the kind of systemic discontinuity that historians will eventually mark as the boundary between one era and the next. We are inside that discontinuity right now. It does not have a clear shape from the inside. The events are moving faster than the analysis. The interactions between crises are producing outcomes that no individual framework adequately captures. The actors making the decisions that are driving the system are themselves operating with incomplete understanding of what their decisions are producing. This is what a genuine historical transition looks like from the inside, not the clean narrative arc that history books impose in retrospect. The confused, overlapping, mutually amplifying sequence of events and decisions that only cohere into a pattern after enough time has passed for the pattern to become visible. The pattern is becoming visible now, not fully, not with the clarity that will eventually be possible, but enough to see the direction, enough to understand what is being lost and what is being constructed in its place, enough to begin the adaptation that waiting for full clarity makes impossible.